Friends, my name's David Hope Jones. I'm the Chief Executive of the Scotland-Malawi Partnership. I'm joining you today from the Scottish borders. This is our seventh of eight governance webinar series, so it's our penultimate session today. Thanks so much for joining us. Looking at the friendly faces and friendly names, I know many of you have been to many of the previous ones, so I'll keep my remarks relatively brief. Associate Professor Asiati Chiweza was due to be chairing this afternoon's session. She has had to give her apologies at short notice for a unforeseen event. We've all been there and not a problem at all. Our two other excellent co-editors, Ken Ross and Wapu, aren't around, so I will step into the breach today, but I will keep my waffling from the Scottish borders as short as it can be, so as not to impede the time for our three headline acts today. I'll say just a few very brief words of introduction, but I know most of you have been to many of the sessions. While I do, please do keep the conversation going by introducing yourself in the chat box. Say hi, share your email if you want to. This is, you know, friends gathering, and networking is always a key part of these sort of events. This webinar series is all about this absolutely fantastic book, and it's brilliant to have a physical copy in my hands. Beyond Impunity: New Directions for Governance in Malawi 2022. It has three co-editors, as I said, Professor Kenneth Ross, Professor Asiati Chiweza, and Professor Wapu Mulwafu. We, the Scotland-Malawi Partnership, the national network that coordinates, represents and supports the Scottish side of the bilateral relationship with our sister network in Malawi. We're really interested in this book as it was being written, as it was being developed, but we didn't want to feed into the sort of copy of the book. We didn't want to write a chapter, but rather where we saw our value add was at the Scottish side to help amplify the end result. So that's what these webinar series are all about. Eight online sessions to be able to look chapter by chapter at key areas of the book, to really listen to the Malawian authors and to be able to have a discussion, and at times to be able to share some experience of learning, warts and all, of from Scotland, our failures as well as our successes. But really today's panel session is all about listening to the Malawian side. We have three outstanding Malawian speakers to present their chapters. Again, I'm keen not to take up too much of our time. We'll keep to 60 minutes. So I think I'm going to move straight on to our first excellent speaker, a well-known friend of the Scotland-Malawi relationship. We were helping him launch his excellent new book, Music in Malawi, just 2 or 3 weeks ago in the Edinburgh City Chambers. But really delighted to introduce Dr. John Lwanda, who's going to be presenting his co-written chapter on the fate of the opposition in Multiparty Malawi 1994 to 2020. So without any further ado, let me hand over to John Lwanda. Dr. Lwanda, over to you.
Thanks, David. Craig, can we have the first slide, please? So our paper examines why, obviously, Malawi's post-Banda governance has been characterized by elected autocracies rather than the expected elected democracies. In our paper, I suppose it speaks for itself in the book. We examine opposition in terms of organization, funding, garnering public support, which Afrobarometer surveys confirm they did have varying amounts of support over the period. We also examine how they survived government attempts at neutering them, and how they managed or did not manage to call the government to account on governance and fiscal issues. It will be argued with examples that apart from the tangible factors which we outline in the book, unresolved, real, imagined or mythological collective memories by both politicians and civil society of pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial, socio-political dispensations and traditions influence current political actors, leading inevitably to a cowed opposition. Craig, please. So, theoretical considerations. Now, the received Western stroke donor viewpoint as outlined by Svasand in his paper on the concept of opposition and structure of opposition in Malawi, states that in a democracy, the concept of opposition usually refers to the role of political parties. Now, we think that this definition is too restrictive for Malawi and favors those who view the legitimacy of economic, social, and political voices as being solely restricted to institutional or authorized parties, as obviously happened in the last 3 or 4 years in Malawi. We prefer the notion of opposition that Brack and Weinblum suggested, that opposition should be understood as the stance of disagreement expressed in the public sphere by mobilized actors through different modes of action, the target of discontent being the government or its policies, the political elite, or the political regime as a whole. Craig, please. Now, our theoretical considerations are based on what we consider that they are structural and agency factors that affect the functioning of the opposition. Okay, the structural argument is quite simple, that when Malawi became independent, we inherited an economy that was based on two. One was the westernized monetary system, and the other one was essentially the barter economy, which you find in the rural areas. And our view is that politicians essentially are able to move between these two economies. I did attempt to outline myself this concept in my paper, Kwacha, the Violence of Money in Malawi Politics, in 2006. So based on this, my view was that one of the strongest limiting factors in the transition to democracy in Malawi is a failure of independent and sustainable cadres of young politicians to emerge. This is caused by the role that money generated via the informal economy plays in Malawi politics. I'll just pause there to be a wee prophet for once. Now, given that I wrote this paper between 1995, I gave it to a meeting when Professor McCracken, I think, was retiring in Sterling sometime in 1996 or something, and it was eventually published in the Journal of Southern African Studies in 2006. And if you, well, I don't think I need to go current to support this concept. Just this role of money and the violence it does to the politics of the country. So that's the first part of it. And then the other part was an excellent, I think it's still unpublished, MA thesis by J.E. Hooper that I found in the Center of Southern African Studies. That time, David Kerr, sorry, not David Kerr, London White was the center director, and he supervised that PhD. So the government was and remains the major source of business and patronage in Malawi. That was essentially the message from the master's thesis. And of course, I don't think anybody could argue that now. The other side of the concept is agency. Now, civil society has several concepts and activities. James Tenga has described civil society as either politically active or politically inactive. And he sees everybody outside the military and the formal government as being part of civil society. So if you regard it in that sort of concept, everybody is part of civil society. Now, civil society can be affected by cultural, religious, personal, ideological ethnicities, incumbency, funding, judiciary, personalities, and all that stuff, education, etc. I just want to say a few things. There's a big subject here, which I don't think anybody has ever explored, how class plays a role in Malawi politics and opposition. Now, all I can highlight is when the middle classes are affected, for example, the academic freedom debate, things are completely resolved. When the middle classes are affected, remember the diesel petrol palibe, when we had no petrol, the donors had pulled out. The middle classes were very active and things were soon resolved. If you compare that with what happens to the masses who are palliated or given the volume of AIP, this is the agricultural input subsidies and all that stuff, you can see the difference. AIP consumes a lot of money every year, but it doesn't get anywhere. And yet, every party, including the opposition, promises to continue with AIP. Another point to make is culture. Now, culture per se does not determine the nature of the opposition, okay? But there are some aspects of Malawi culture that really get into it, and hence our title, Aona Nyekwe. Mawik, who studied the Chewa of Zambia, but the Chewa are in Zambia, Malawi, Mozambique, and so on, reported that there were harsh punishments among the Chewa, okay, which controlled theft, adultery, disobedience, keeping these at a minimum. And in fact, if somebody misbehaved, people could be banished from the village and the chiefly administrations. Now, over the years, I think, people have gone into exile. You talk about dissidents and, so forth and so on, being forced into exile. Mazrui argued that cultural factors do play into politics, have got a role in politics, because politicians are part of society. And he says that culture is part of the lenses of perception, cognition, models of human behavior, etc. But the same as Ruby saw our oral traditions as traditions of conformity rather than heresy. So we all have to conform rather than oppose. So there's this sort of thing. And out of all, the theoretical things I'm pointing out in Malawi, just to highlight it, that we have these concepts of harsh punishments and zeleka and the accidentalizations and winalira, Aona Nyekwe. Even our hero Chipembere was a hero but a loser. So Chipembere is not somebody you want to emulate, because you're going to be a hero but you're going to lose. The consequences of this, as Chishindo wrote in his nice whip paper, for those who are interested in language, was that, sorry, the next one, please, Craig. And the next one again, I think I missed it. Yeah, and the next. Okay, so as he wrote in his nice paper, was that Ndale, i.e. the vernacular for politics, has connotation of tripping each other. You're really tripping somebody. So politics is concerned with winning, the holding of government power. You win the power, and you make your opponents stumble. And better still, you want them to disappear completely from the field of play, rather than, keep them there. And indeed, during the one-party state, those who opposed, i.e. Otuta, became Zigawenga and were classed as, essentially Zirombo, beasts. All these factors, I suppose, play on the political psyche, where even the people in the opposition want to be part or to have attachments to the ruling party, so that when things change, they're in a position to benefit. It's about benefit, and it's about winning. Okay, Craig, can you go back a bit so that maybe the slides that were missed? Are you able to do that? Yeah. Okay, back a bit. Yeah, so we did that. Next one, forward. So we did the agency, and Tenga Tenga has written beautifully about the role of civil society in politics. And the next one, okay, talking about the harsh punishments, and Mazrui's oral tradition is a tradition of conformity. Malawi, as you know, is an oral culture. You know, everything is oral. You know, and we move one thing to the other, and oral memory can be very short and very, you know, liable to twisting. Next one, Craig, please. Oh yeah, that's it. Thank you very much.
Dr. Lwanda, thank you very much indeed. Sorry, I had a slight technical challenge there, but I think resolved now. Thank you very much indeed. We're keen to move to our next speaker. Oh, we did have one question actually I wanted to pull out. I don't know whether Linda, whether you wanted to ask your question, if you're there, Linda.
Thank you, David. I was just commenting that AIP is a sensitive issue, and I wonder why all political parties continue with it, why it does not even achieve much. So it's a comment as well as a question, I guess.
I know it's a sensitive one, but Dr. Lwanda, if you'd like to respond.
Yes. Oh, okay. I did say that AIP is essentially a palliative, like Valium, to keep the masses quiet. Because it essentially is not going to solve anything. The billions we're spending on AIP, I'm not an economist, but it's straightforward. You could build infrastructures that are more sustainable rather than wasting the same money year in, year out. So I was trying to make the point that if it's a middle class issue, we had the academic freedom debate. The middle classes stood their ground and the government gave way. They won. You know, and you know, when there's no petrol, diesel, palibe, you know, you get the middle classes. They come out. The civil society is activated at that point. Whereas AIP, there's no particular leadership. Even the chiefs, you know, follow what the government line is. They seem to lose their leadership of their people. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Lwanda, for your presentation, for answering that question. Please do, through our next two speakers, feel free to put questions, as Linda did, in the chat box, and if time, I'll call on maybe one question between our speakers, and then we have more time at the end of the session to have more of a discussion. But let's move on to our next excellent speaker. I'm really thrilled to have Professor Dan Kuwali with us, who's joining us, I think, from Pennsylvania today to present his chapter, Guarding the Guardians, Auditing the Security Sector in Malawi. Over to you, Professor Kuwali.
Yeah, thanks so much, David. You've highlighted the title of my chapter, and thanks for the opportunity to allow me to submit a chapter in this very important and timely book. So my presentation will be precise and I'll try to be concise. I divide it into three phases. Number one will be just to scope the evolution of the security sector in Malawi. I'll focus on the adoption of the national security policy. And then I'll highlight some of the key challenges by way of a juridical audit on the security sector in Malawi. And before I close, I'll try to provide some recommendations on how we can overcome these challenges. So let me start with takeaways. Number one is that the gap in section 13 of the Constitution, which provides for guidelines for national policy, omitted to include guidelines on national security policy. And this omission has opened room for security to be at the whims of politicians. What I'm trying to say here is that the political order of the day would determine what the national policy is. The second point I want to drive home really is that although we adopted the national security policy in March of 2018, this policy, yes, seeks to coordinate the roles of the different actors in the security sector in Malawi. However, the security organs still operate in silos. There is no coordination. And for this reason, I'm suggesting that we need, as a matter of urgency, operationalize the Office of the National Security Advisor, which is based in the National Security Council. The third point is that the security sector governance training should not only focus on the professionalization of the security actors, but it should also target civil authorities, civil leaders, including members of parliament, so that they are able to understand their roles and responsibilities with regard to security sector. I'm providing this recommendation because this is the only way you can tame political influence of the security sector. So just to give you an overview of the national security policy, which, like I said, was adopted in March 2018, this policy was adopted simultaneously with the national peace policy. And the NSP, for short, highlighted the shift from focusing on state security to what is known as human security, which is security of the individual. We're looking at the day-to-day threats and fears of the individual. So human security as is a concept that was adopted by the United Nations Development Program in 1994 after the end of the Cold War, where states started to focus on human security as opposed to state security. Has non-traditional actors involved in the provision of human security. So you see that in the NSP, we have also included agencies such as the judiciary, the civil society, and even the media as part and parcel of the security sector in Malawi. The NSP has also adopted a whole of government approach, which in short is a multi-stakeholder approach, where you look at security problems with holistic lenses. Granted, the NSP has tried to close the gap which was left in section 13 of the Constitution. Now, let me just point out one or two challenges that we see in the security sector in Malawi today. So the first one, you heard Dr. Lwanda talking about the protests by the middle class in Malawi. So yes, in the democratic dispensation, people have the right to protest. Of course, the Constitution requires that those protests should be peaceful. Now, we see that on the 20th of July, 2011, the then president of Malawi had ordered the police to shoot to kill. Yet the Police Act abhors a policy of shoot to kill because the training of the police requires that the police should shoot to harm and not to injure or to kill, so to speak. Even the law as provided for in the Police Act does not provide for shooting to kill. So that order really was illegal, and it requires proper training of the police and professionalism to understand such illegal orders. In the case of Malawi Law Society against the president, Justice Twere noted that the police, actually Justice Twere noted that the Constitution of the Republic of Malawi guarantees the right to freedom of assembly. And yet, at the same time, the Constitution requires the police to provide protection, even to protesters. Therefore, the onus is on the conveners of demonstrations to ensure that the demonstrations are peaceful and non-violent. So this is a balancing act that is provided by the Constitution. On the one hand, there is that right guaranteed by the Constitution. On the other hand, there is that obligation on the police to provide protection. So the onus falls on the conveners to ensure that this is done peacefully. In the case of National Consultative Council against the Attorney General, again, Justice Twere gave a very prominent thesis that in a democratic era, the police are required, or law enforcement, so to speak, are required to sharpen their skills and competence in order to comply with the guidelines on the use of force and firearms. So what I'm trying to say here is that the challenges, since we have the right to protest guaranteed by the Constitution, so the police are supposed to align their training, align their equipment in order to be able to perform their functions in accordance with the law. So this demands sharpening skills and competence. So they need to use tactical weapons that do not violate the rights of the protesters, for example, and they need to up their game, in short. The other challenge that I see is that of professionalism, both in the police, the military, and all other security organs in Malawi. So with a focus on the police, you see that since the advent of democracy in Malawi, there has been a paradigm shift from policing the public to serving the public. And yet in some cases, we've seen that the mindset of the police has not followed suit. I also note in the chapter the issue of academic freedom at the then Chancellor College of the University of Malawi. You see that the then president even stepped in to say that I ordered the Inspector General to interview the lecturer in question in my capacity as the Commander-in-Chief of the Malawi Police Service. But we all know that Section 78 of the Constitution does not make the president Commander-in-Chief of the police. He is not. And I argue that he should not, because he can only be the Commander-in-Chief of the military for obvious reasons. So political influence is prevalent or has been prevalent in Malawi with regards to the functions of the police. Then the other challenge I note is the absence of a policy on correctional services. So it is clear that the conditions in Malawi prisons are harsh, but what is not clear is whether those harsh conditions contribute to reformation of the criminals, or rather even harden the criminals. But the picture that comes out looking at the habitual offenders, you see that the opposite is true. The conditions in Malawi prisons actually harden criminals. So we're defeating the whole purpose of correction in this particular case. And yet we do not have, as far as I'm concerned, a policy on correctional services in Malawi. The other point noted is the loopholes in migration management laws in Malawi. What is prominent is that there is no independent law establishing the immigration department. So if you want to look at the provisions relating to immigration department, you have to look at the Constitution, you have to look at the Immigration Act, you have to look at the Malawi Citizenship Act, and yet there is no proper establishment of that very important department. I also noticed that there is no link between the newly established National Registration Bureau and the Immigration Department, which means there is a risk that these two bodies may duplicate their respective roles. The other challenges that I've seen relate to politicization of the National Intelligence Services. So, for example, we've seen a change back and forth of the name of the National Intelligence Services. Sometimes one day it will be called National Intelligence Bureau, the next day it will be called National Intelligence Services, depending on the political test of the government in power at that time. However, we adopted the National Intelligence Services Act in 2018. So I'm arguing that we need to implement this law according to the intention of its drafters. We have also been witnesses to the fact that political cadres have been recruited by the National Intelligence Services, and these political cadres do not even have the technical expertise to perform such important roles, such as collection of intelligence, management of knowledge and intelligence or information. So, I mean, I'm arguing that this also is a challenge that may need to be addressed. The other point, still with regards to National Intelligence Services, is the absence of a complaints tribunal, which, according to the National Intelligence Services Act, is supposed to be an oversight body for the NIS. This body is still not established, and yet it is very important. The other challenge that I've highlighted in the chapter is the question of upholding constitutional order. We would recall that in 2012, the Malawi Defense Force stepped in to argue or to advise that the vice president was the one who was constitutionally mandated to take over when the incumbent president died. So that was one way of performing the roles of the Malawi Defense Force, which is to uphold constitutional order. And yet there is still, we still do not have clarity on what it really means to uphold constitutional order. But Justice Tambala, in the case of National Consultative Council against the Attorney General, as early as 1994, provided guidance on what this means. In short, Justice Tambala stated that upholding constitutional order entails performing functions without violating the rights and freedoms according to the people and not frustrating the will of the people. And I emphasize not frustrating the will of the people because, as you're aware, the Constitution hinges on the fact that it shall always protect the will of the people, hence the right to vote, hence public duty owed by public officers to the people. The other challenge that I've seen is that of democratic control of the security sector, or others would call civilian control of the military or civilian control of the security sector. The question of control is still subject to debate, or maybe there is lack of understanding of what control entails. We would recall that Dr. Kainja, who is the current Inspector General, was actually ordered by the then government to deploy to a foreign mission by way of exercising civilian control of the security sector. But as we may have noted from the court in judicial review proceedings, that decision was quashed as unlawful because it was aimed at victimizing the officer in question. So you see how politicians would abuse the aspect of control. So what we need is to understand that illegal orders cannot be obeyed. This is provided for in the Constitution, and it is also part of professionalism of the security sector. Now, what do we need to do to overcome these challenges? I have highlighted some recommendations in the chapter, starting with recommending that we need to incorporate principles of national policy in section 13 of the Constitution, just like all the other policy guidelines that have been outlined in that important provision. We also need to establish an oversight role of the Police Service Commission to cushion the police service from political interference. If you read the provision that caters for the police in the Constitution, you see that the dominant guideline is that the police should be independent. The police should be cushioned from political interference. Now, the fact that the Police Service Commission is only limited to disciplinary oversight and leaving out the actual oversight for control, it opens room for politicians to have influence over the police. So we need to mandate the Police Service Commission to be able to have oversight role of the police. At the moment, the oversight role is with the courts, but we all know how long it takes to submit a complaint or a concern before the court. The other recommendation that I've advanced is that we need to reform the correctional services so that we should achieve the principles of punishment, that is to say, reformation of offenders. If you look at the Prisons Services Act, you see that even the revenue that is obtained by the correctional authorities is supposed to be deposited in the consolidated account. But I'm suggesting that looking at the dire conditions of prisons in Malawi, that money, in as much as it's public funds, but it has to be redirected towards helping the prisoners in terms of food, because their diet is also in question. There is also need to link the correctional services with the judiciary. The point I'm trying to make here is that you see that one will be sentenced to, say, 10 years imprisonment with hard labor, but after that particular person or just before they are released, there is no assessment done whether they've been reformed or not. So they'll just be released, and no report, as far as I'm concerned, goes to the judiciary. So we really do not have an assessment of whether the punishment has achieved its purpose. So I'm trying to suggest that we need to have that link. And I'm also suggesting that we need to reconcile the citizenship and migration management legislation so that the immigration department can be properly established, and we should avoid the duplication of labor and waste of resources between the National Registration Bureau and the immigration department. I'm also arguing that we need to implement the National Intelligence Services Act to the letter in order to ensure professionalism of the public officers in the NIS. And also we need to bring awareness to the public officers, because I'm pretty certain that most do not even understand or are aware that there is that NIC Act exists. I'm also suggesting that we need to arrest the politicization of the military and the militarization of politics. By politicization of the military, I'm trying to point out the fact that sometimes you see that there is a political influence of civilian authorities in the military. So this should be curtailed. Militarization of politics is where the military may be deployed to pursue the political ends of an individual politician. This again is unconstitutional, and we need to cushion it. I'm also suggesting that we need to enhance the professionalization of the police. We saw that time and again, the Malawi Defense Force has stepped in to do policing functions. Why? Because the general public does not really trust the police. So, I mean, in as much as the Constitution provides such a mandate to Malawi Defense Force, but irregular or frequent deployment of the Malawi Defense Force in policing functions may may actually cause challenges, because the military really is not trained or does not focus its training on such roles. So notoriety is also something that can arise from those functions. So what we need to do is the training in security sector governance should also be directed at the police, because if you look at the international support that we've received in terms of training, most foreign partners give the training to the military, and the police is rarely trained. So we need to also work on professionalization of the police. And lastly, I'm arguing that we need to regulate private security companies, because at the moment you see there is a proliferation of private security companies, some even wearing the same uniform as the military or the police. This, if not regulated, may cause confusion. So basically, these are the points that I've argued in the paper, and I'll be happy to take questions. And I thank you so much for your attention.
Professor Kuwali, thank you very much indeed. Very much appreciate that. And I think it's brilliant to finish with 8 very clear, tangible recommendations to take forwards. So thank you for that. We're going to fly now from Pennsylvania back to Lilongwe, and really delighted to introduce Honourable Dr. Mphatso Jones Boti Phiri, MP. Dr. Phiri, over to you.
Thank you so much for having me, and I really appreciate this time that I can actually share some of my research and the book that I contributed. So the title of the book chapter is The Executive Supremacy and the Armed Forces, a Case of Public Finance Management in Malawi. Basically the focus, we can have the next slide. So the scope of the presentation will actually, I will do the introduction, the methodological issues, and then the research findings and the conclusion. So it's not a very long presentation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So basically, the motivation behind this contribution is actually the look at public finance management and its connection with principles of good governance, and looking at how the armed forces actually are accountable to the public finance that they are allocated by the National Assembly. So looking at the literature in Malawi, there is very little or no research at all that touches on security governance as far as public finance management is concerned. So in this book chapter, my focus really is to show that in our country, there is executive dominance of the armed forces, and actually that negates some of the principles of good governance, and at the same time, it actually weakens governance in general, because the executive has so much power and influence over the management of the armed forces itself. Next slide, please. So quickly, some methodological issues. I did some face-to-face interviews with the military officers, members of parliament, parliamentary staff, and officials from the Ministry of Defense. And as a way of giving it some theoretical touch, I used the historical institutionalism to actually appreciate the broader policy trajectory, and also look at how the security governance in Malawi has been practiced over time. And basically focusing on public expenditure and accountability of the armed forces. So I looked at historical constitutionalism as one of those theories that kind of describes the reasons for persistent trajectory of a given policy, decision, and how some occasional changes actually occur in the process. The next slide, please. So now let's dive into the issues, the research findings themselves. So one of the critical issues that are in the chapter is on the institutional framework for security governance and financial oversight in the armed forces. And one of the critical institutions is basically the Ministry of Defense, the MOD. So through interviews and research within the MOD, and actually through interviews with members of the Defense Force, it came apparent in the research results that the military has an extensive latitude in its budgeting and procurement processes that actually weakens the prudent public finance management as provided in the Public Finance Management Act. And we'll briefly look at some of these provisions later in the presentation itself. And the second thing is that because the Ministry of Defense itself is understaffed and lacks a lot of expertise in defense budget and also oversight mechanisms, as a result, the military regulates its own financial prudence through the Office of the Inspector General. So the military, the armed forces in Malawi has the Office of the Inspector General, not the one from the police, but this one is from the armed forces itself. So the Office of the Inspector General is actually not independent, as it operates within the Office of the Commander of the Defense Force. So the Commander of the Defense Force will appoint an individual, a general, to become the Inspector General. And this Office of the Inspector General is actually involved in the audits, in the ethics, and all those other things that are to do with finance management. Of course, we also have to appreciate that the military is actually audited by the Auditor General using the Public Audit Act. However, if we look at the literature, we look at our own, if we go back into our own circles, we'll see that there is very little that is actually coming out of the public audit that is done by the Auditor General for the armed forces. So because of that, the Office of the Inspector General is pivotal in the oversight of the military expenditure itself through its own audits. So in other words, the military audits itself. The next slide, please. So now, the Ministry of Defense in Malawi is basically that institution that cushions the military from the politicians. In other words, it is the Ministry of Defense that is actually supposed to consolidate all the budgets and all the and explain all the expenditure of the military to the National Assembly. In other words, the Minister of Defense is supposed to be in the National Assembly defending the expenditure or actually lobbying for more expenditure for the armed forces in Malawi. However, since 2014, since 2004, actually, the president has at times served as the Minister of Defense. This started with late President Bingu wa Mutharika, and it is actually the current situation at the moment where the president is also a Minister of Defense. Now, when we look at this and we relate it to the provisions in the Public Finance Act, there are some controversies, or rather there is some kind of governance dilemma that emanates from that. For example, Section 3 of the Public Finance Act actually stipulates that the minister is responsible to cabinet and to National Assembly. And basically is responsible in ensuring adequate procedures, internal controls, and guidelines exist for the use of public money and public resources. And is supposed to also have that compliance by the Ministry of Finance with its responsibilities under this act. So that's the provision of what a minister within the Ministry of Defense is supposed to do. The next slide, please. And Section 4 stipulates that the minister is responsible for the supervision of financial assets and all those other things to do with public monies that are spent within that ministry. Now, if we are to go back to what I said earlier on about the governance dilemmas, is that when the president becomes the Minister of Defense, constitutionally, he cannot go to that committee of parliament and actually be accountable to it because he is the head of state. And he is supposed to be accountable to cabinet while he is the head of the cabinet itself. As a result, it appears that everything that the Minister of Defense in his ministry is supposed to do is actually delegated to the deputy minister. However, if we look at Section 5 of the same Public Finance Management Act, we'll see that it stipulates that the minister under this act, the Public Finance Management Act, shall not be derogated merely by his having exercised his power of delegation under this act. So in other words, as a Minister of Defense, you cannot delegate everything to the Deputy Minister to do it on your behalf. It will be excessive delegation, and in other words, it will actually put in question the whole intention of the act itself. Next slide, please. So again, we are trying, in this chapter, I'm trying to look at looking further at the governance kind of dilemma that comes with the office of the president being the Minister of Defense. We look at the Malawi Constitution. It stipulates that the ultimate responsibility of the defense forces of Malawi shall vest in the president as the commander-in-chief. This is correct. And then it further states that any power conferred on the president by the Constitution shall be exercised on the recommendations of the Defense Force Council. Now, you look at the composition of the council itself, it's actually chaired by the Minister of Defense. So in this, what I have explained before, it means as a president, you are the commander-in-chief of the Defense Force. You are also supposed to chair the Defense Council, and basically you report to yourself. In other words, when we look at all these provisions and then we relate them to the issues of public finance management, it shows that there is a governance kind of challenge in the management of the finances, reporting, and also actually negotiating for the armed forces themselves. Next slide, please. Now, having looked at the issue of the MOD, the Ministry of Defense, now we look at the issue of the legislature, the National Assembly itself. So basically, the National Assembly itself has to perform that overall function of oversight. That's the job for the National Assembly. And research has shown it through the interviews that I did, and actually common knowledge, because I'm in Parliament, I know that there is very little physical expertise in the members of Parliament. So most of them, they lack the specialized knowledge in the defense budget itself. And we look further because the whole National Assembly may not perform the overall function of oversight of the armed forces and its finances. Then we have the Defense and Security Committee of Parliament that is actually supposed to do that oversight. However, research has shown that there is actually, they have no touch on the public expenditure of the secretive national security operations. In other words, because the national security operations are secretive in nature, then in other jurisdictions, you go to America, you go to the UK, the Defense and Security, the Defense and Intelligence Committee of the of Parliament in those countries, they have what is known as the security clearance, where they are able to scrutinize the sensitive information that is within the armed forces. In our case, nothing like that exists. As a result, the Defense and Security Committee of Parliament perform the little oversight function that they are supposed to do as far as public finance management is concerned. And as a rule, as a standing order as well, within the National Assembly, there is a standing order that prohibits any discussion that are security in nature within the National Assembly itself. So because of all that, there is that lack of oversight over the public finance management of the armed forces, even within the Defense and Security Committee of Parliament. And to add more and more of these weaknesses is that the parliamentary staff, there is very little or no professional knowledge or sufficient knowledge or expertise in military institutional requirements and expenditure of public money within the armed forces. So there is no staff that actually focus on this, and then they can do that research and feed it to the Committee of the Defense and Security of Parliament itself. So in other words, that weakness, all these things actually indicate that there is that weakness within the legislature in the oversight of the fiscal expenditure in the armed forces itself. And this actually weakens the whole idea of public finance management in the armed forces itself. And by extension, it actually weakens the good governance requirements that are supposed to be there. Next slide, please. So my presentation will actually finish with this slide, because this slide now is actually trying to appreciate what is written in the chapter about the historical context of public finance in the armed forces in our country. So basically, since the policies adopted by all post-independence heads of states have actually reduced the legislative powers and created executive dominance in the overall management of the Malawi Defense Force, or in the overall management of the armed forces in Malawi. And this actually has, by extension, weakened the oversight of military public expenditure. In other words, it is almost non-existent. Now, if we look at it historically, from the time Dr. Banda was the president of this country from independence, he did a lot of restructuring of the army then, and procured a lot of military assets. And in that time, he was the only leader and the only one. He was a dictator, no opposition, nothing. So he had no need to actually show how much he has spent, in other words, on the armed forces, and how the armed forces are actually managing the public finances. And through this, when we adopted the multi-party democracy in 1993-94, President Muluzi, former president of this country, also kind of continued on the same path as adopted by Dr. Banda. And the most interesting issue here now is how he actually influenced, and this takes me to the last slide, how he has actually, how he influenced, no, let's go. So the last point on this slide, I'm sorry. So basically, former President Muluzi actually initiated what we may actually term as a patronage kind of control, or patronage politics, or patronage control of the armed forces. Between 1994 to 1998, in the space of actually 4 years, President Muluzi changed 5 commanders of the defense force, of the armed forces. 5 of them in a period of 4 years. Actually, one died in office. So basically, we could argue that he changed it 4 times within 4 years. And he got the right one who stayed until the end of his tenure, his second tenure. And we saw the repeat of that when former President Peter Mutharika also got into power in 2014, like 20 years later. Within a period of 5 years, he also changed 4 generals in the defense force. So in other words, the legal provisions allow the president to fire, basically without giving any reason, the commanders of the armed forces, or the commander of the armed forces in Malawi. And because of that, we could argue actually that reinforces some kind of patronage, some kind of relationship that it develops between the president and the commander he favors. That kind of relationship actually weakens any other control of the armed forces from outside the president and the commander himself. So in other words, with this, we have a weakened kind of oversight of the defense force in general, and a weakened oversight in the public finance management and the public expenditure of the armed forces in the country. So that's what the chapter do. And basically, there are so many examples that are given in the chapter on how the Public Finance Management Act is actually ignored, or rather is negated, and how the executive supremacy itself has actually weakened the provisions or the prudent accountability of the public finances. Let me end there, and I think the last slide is on the questions and comments that we may have. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much indeed, Honourable Dr. Mphatso Jones, Boti, Phiri MP. An excellent presentation and a really fantastic chapter. We've got maybe just 10 minutes or so left, and I'm keen to get a good number of questions through. Thanks to everyone who have put questions in the chat box. Please do continue to do so. I don't know whether the first question that came up there was from Charles Gay. I'm not sure whether you feel your question's been answered fully, but Charles, over to you if you would like to amend your question at all.
Thanks, David, and thanks to Dr. Jones there. I think you answered my question. I was going to ask about parliamentary oversight, and you gave a very detailed answer about the limitations of parliamentary oversight of the security forces. Just reflecting on the UK situation in Public Accounts Committee, is very difficult to scrutinise military spending or hold accountable through the UK Parliament. That much I know about, but in Malawi, it seems that you have the same restricted accountability of the security forces to parliamentary committees. Is that right?
Yes, so basically that's very correct. And to answer the question, I think there is also another question that relates to that, and it says, can the Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee attempt to ask questions on the military, or is there any oversight role that they can do on that? Yes, they can attempt to do that, but they are always limited or rather restricted, because there is always an argument that it is a national security issue, therefore it cannot be discussed with this, for example, Public Accounts Committee. However, the committee that can be given that security clearance is the Defense Intelligence Security Committee. However, it doesn't have that security clearance as well. So if say the executive or the military wants to actually hide anything as far as accountability is concerned, they will play a card of security. It's a matter of national security, therefore it cannot be discussed. I don't know if that answers the question.
If you're happy with that, Charles.
Yes, I think it does. I think it's a familiar problem, and very hard to then also monitor spending or overspending or runaway costs on different military projects or security sector costs as well, I think. So yeah, I think it's a familiar problem. So thank you for that answer. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Charles. In this session, unlike all the others, we don't have a formal Scottish respondent. So thanks, Charles, for jumping in and drawing, I think, a really helpful parallel with the situation UK and Malawi. Gertrude Chirambo, are you there to voice your question?
Yeah, yes, thank you, David. I was just wondering whether we have a comparative analysis of what works in other nations, especially in Africa, where the president is also holding position of Minister of Defense, and whether they also have deputies, and whether it works or whether they're experiencing the same challenges as far as financial accountability is concerned. Thank you.
Can I jump in?
Please go ahead, Dr. Phiri.
Okay, thank you so much. So basically, I would say I haven't done that comparative analysis in this case. However, there are very few other countries where the president doubles as the Minister of Defense and as the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. Basically, if we are to go into those case studies, we may actually, because of how we have practiced our politics, I would actually conclude, even without doing a research, that we will actually find similar problems as far as accountability of public finances are concerned. So to answer the question, I haven't done that critical comparative analysis or comparative analysis on how in other jurisdictions, how it works in other jurisdictions, and if they have devised a way of actually overcoming some of the challenges that are outlined in the chapter itself.
Can I come in from a political angle, David?
Please do, John.
Yeah, I think there was a clue there that Dr. Phiri mentioned that Makili Muluzi changed generals a few times. And obviously the president is always, no, not always, sorry, inevitably the Minister of Defense. And I think we know in Malawi we've had Cashgate, and one of the conduits, obviously, of, to use a pompous word, extravating money from government coffers is via that route. So this secret defense budget and all that stuff, you know, we've got lots of examples. I don't want to be too political and journalistic, but you know, selling of jets and all that stuff all comes into that scenario, pointing to the way our patronage works to subvert, you know, accountability. Thank you.
That's really helpful. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Lwanda. I think time for just one more question. I see a question from Gary at the Church of Scotland. Gary, if you're there and you wish to voice your question.
Yeah, thanks. Let me just open it up again. Yeah, my question was to you, Professor Kuwali, or anyone else who wants to chip in. I liked your insights and recommendations on things that could be done to strengthen security. How would you prioritize them? Or would you say there are some that are essential to do ahead of another election, given the role of MDF and the police force in the post-election period, most recent? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I think I responded in the chat, but for purposes of the audience, number one is the police should enhance their capacity to be able to tackle or to perform their roles. And that will also help the security sector to cushion the Malawi Defense Force from being involved in internal law enforcement operations, which may bring notoriety. And as you're aware, familiarity brings contempt. So if we let the Malawi Defense Force focus on its traditional roles, and the police should be able to perform their functions, that will be, I think, number one issue that we need to sort out. Number two is, I think if you look from the perspective of the African Union, they are focusing much on security sector reform. The AU security sector reform policy framework was adopted in 2013, but a lot has happened to the security sector in our countries. So I think the focus now should move from security sector reform to security sector governance, where we're looking at how decisions are made, how accountable security institutions are. And in doing so, it should be a two-way traffic. While training the security sector actors to be professional, the civilian leaders as well as MPs should also understand their roles. In so doing, we ensure that the security sector is professional, has integrity, and where the security sector has integrity, is professional, will basically prevent the challenges that have been raised by, for example, Dr. Lwanda, that they are used as a conduit for misappropriation of funds and those kind of things. Yeah, because they'll be they'll be regarded as professional, and they'll be manifesting integrity. So, number one, like I said, the police should step up their game. Number two, security sector governance should be both ways. The police, rather the security actors, as well as those civilians who are in control of security actors. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Friends, I think we're out of time, so I will begin to draw the threads together. Let me start by thanking our three excellent Malawian speakers, Dr. John Lwanda for his excellent chapter on the fate of the opposition multi-party in Malawi, Professor Dan Kuwali, who we were just hearing from there, for his chapter Auditing Security Sector Governance in Malawi, and Honourable Dr. Mphatso Jones Boti Phiri MP for his chapter Executive Supremacy and the Armed Forces, a case study of public finance management in Malawi. Thank you to you for your excellent questions and for taking part in this, our seventh in this series, Governance. All three of those chapters are in this excellent book. Really encourage you to buy a copy when you're able to. Slightly embarrassingly, given that this is a Malawian publication, the non-Malawian version has been available first for the last couple of months. You've been able to buy it, and as I said in the chat box, you can get that in the African Books Collective or online on Amazon. That's printed on demand. It's £40, slightly more expensive, but the proper Malawian version is now printed. There were various COVID and other delays, but it is now printed in Malawi. I think there is an initial print run of 500 copies. The Scotland-Malawi Partnership has really been delighted to offer financial support to make sure that it's printed in Malawi. Half of those copies are going to be available commercially within Malawi, full details to follow, at a far more affordable price. And the other half will be freely available to learning institutions and governance institutions across Malawi. Friends, our next and final session is going to happen usual last Wednesday of the month. That's Wednesday, the 25th of May, same time, 3 p.m. Malawi, 2 p.m. UK. It's going to be another panel session. We've got ethnicity and regionalism. We've got natural resources. We've got COVID-19 and governance, and faith perspectives on governance on the agenda Another excellent lineup of speakers: Associate Professor Asiati Chiweza, Dr. Gift Kaira, Dr. Paul Banda, Dr. Professor Wapu Mulwafu, Dr. Bryson Nkoma, Dr. Gift Kaira, Dr. Paul Banda, Dr. Mzi Mavula, and Dr. Professor Kenneth Ross as well. Now, because that's our last session, I think what we're going to do is have 90 minutes, and we're going to have those excellent presenters. We're going to have time for discussion, but we're also going to have a very open space discussion, I guess, under the title of what next. I think this book is brilliant. I think it captures from many different important angles key points of governance in the Malawian perspective, particularly looking back the way, particularly looking at the era running up to the rerun, the fresh elections, presidential elections in 2020. And what we want to do on the 25th of May, in addition to hearing from those speakers, is to hear from you. What next should we be doing? Both that academic community of 25 leading Malawian authors who together have published this excellent book, but also the Scotland-Malawi partnership. Are there different ways that we can be using our bilateral relationship to support governance strengthenings in both our nations within the spirit and principles of solidarity, of mutual respect and mutual understanding? As Charles Gay said in his question, there are obvious parallels on many of the challenges that we've explored in this series. So I really hope you can join us on the 25th of May. Please, between now and then, do think about what do you want us to do next? How should we be using the bilateral relationship? Perhaps to look from the historical to the forward-looking. And I really think the presentations we had today have been fantastic, particularly because they've had those tangible recommendations there. So I hope you can join us, and thank you once again to our speakers. If you wish to, please do feel free to turn on your camera and say goodbye. It's always fun to see faces. But thank you very much for your time, and thank you to our three excellent speakers. Good afternoon.